The idea of doing a series based on classic monsters was always super exciting. I've been trying for years to figure out how do you put the right spin on stories that we've seen, you know, dozens of times, Frankenstein, Dracula, the Werewolf. And I wanted to do something that was, you know, aimed a little more at younger kids, but, you know, stuff that was still real cutting edge and cool and, you know, more along maybe the Goosebumps line, but still with an edge and dealing specifically with all the famous monsters I grew up with.
The Mummy, the living dead, bringing terror and death across 4,000 years.
The idea of doing this film monster series and doing each of these monsters coming back as reborn or retold, really, finally came to me about a year ago in 1997, and I thought, well, let's start developing screenplays on the first 6. So we wrote and developed Frankenstein Reborn and the Werewolf Reborn and the Mummy Reborn and the Invisible Man Reborn and so forth and so on. And the 2 that I liked the most were the first 2, in fact, we made, both Frankenstein and the Werewolf. What fascinated me as a kid growing up looking, you know, occasionally on TV at like the classic Universal monster movies of the 30s and 40s was, again, their sort of gothic setting, the simplicity, in a sense, of the stories, because when you really think of it today, a lot of these sci-fi, fantasy, and horror films are really complicated and sometimes very convoluted, and we really don't have horror stars anymore. There's no longer Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi. You know, there's not one actor who you can think of who's like a super horror star. And the thought, of course, was not to necessarily bring back stars or try to find people who would become stars in these movies, but to kind of recreate a really gothic, cool setting, to bring the monsters back, the monsters that I grew up with.
Dracula, Prince of Darkness.
Father was Frankenstein, that your mother was the lightning.
The most dreaded creation of man, the monster of Frankenstein, stalks again. Here is drama completely strange, full of weird suspense. With this great cast, Sir Cedric Hardwicke, Lionel Atwill, Ralph Bellamy, Bela Lugosi, Evelyn Ankers, Lon Chaney, in the gripping tale of a monster the tomb cannot engulf, chains cannot hold.
I wanted to do something that we had not seen before because, again, I'm not sure how many dozens of versions of Frankenstein and hundreds of different movies involving Dracula there are. But how do you take all these wonderful monsters and put them sort of in one series and stay as truthful still and as faithful as you can to the underlying material? So the idea of bringing in young teens into these stories and weaving them in a way that sort of makes organic sense was where I started from. One of the ideas, which I think we're now pulling off pretty successfully, was to cast actors, young actors and actresses from hopefully well-known current programs that are on television, so that these young people aren't unknown quantities. When you see them, you may recognize Ashley Cafagna from Saved by the Bell and others who have been in other successful TV series. So yeah, I think it helps with otherwise unfamiliar territory. We have new monsters we're creating in cool settings, but the idea was and will continue to be to cast kids who you will, the audience will recognize from other shows.
Young people and teenagers always liked the Wolfman, the Lon Chaney figure, which was the most popular werewolf in the movies until that time. And I think one of the things that kids relate to is the werewolf is going through physical changes and is having difficulty keeping his emotions in check, and essentially going through what every adolescent goes through in the process of growing up. And I think what these movies let kids do is enter into these anxieties and fears in a very controlled way, because monster movies are always controlled rituals. Nothing gets too out of hand, and you're safe. You can experience the emotions of fear, but you have a certain amount of control over them, because you always pretty much know how a monster movie is going to end. The monster is going to be put back in its grave or its box, or will have a silver bullet put through its heart, at least until the next film. And I think this is what one of the major functions of horror movies, not just for kids, but for society in general. They let us process all kinds of things we don't want to look at too directly, that would be too unsettling, and at least work through, to some extent, everyday anxieties and fears, and then we can get on with our lives. The werewolf, most of all, signifies the loss of control over one's physical urges and emotions, which is something certainly adolescent boys can especially relate to. And it's not surprising that the Wolfman and other werewolves are usually the favorite monster of teenage boys at a certain age. It's also the fear of the dark side in general. You know, we all have feelings and emotions, even after we're all grown up and we're no longer adolescents, that we don't want to fully admit to. Each of us does have a dark side that could erupt.
To play a werewolf, I mean, it's just a classic monster. You know, so many other great horror actors have got to play a werewolf at some point. You find that the masks almost, it's almost a possession that happens once you place the mask over your face. And I think it's the same when you have all this prosthetic makeup. You actually can scare yourself a little bit sometimes. And I had a few moments of anxiety, like in the woods that night. You feel a certain possession. You feel that the almost like the character, almost like the werewolf is taking over you as an actor, just like Peter Cranach was possessed by the werewolf.
Listen to me very carefully. You must not attempt to leave this room tonight, no matter what you may hear. And you may hear nothing, but no matter what happens, you must not leave this room.
What is going on?
I wish to God I knew. Please, please, stay in this room.
She knows in her mind what the right thing is to do, and she wants to do the right thing, but yet she also loves her uncle. So I think I sometimes do that in my own life. I really want to do what I want, but yet I need to do the right thing too. So it's kind of the same type of situations in my life. Not with a werewolf, of course, though, nothing like that. I've never worked with a monster before, any type of monster or werewolf, so it was kind of, it was really hard because a lot of the times he'd be sitting there in this costume and I'd look at him and like get freaked out because I would have to realize it really wasn't him. You know, it wasn't the werewolf, it's really him, so it was kind of different being able to work with all the special effects and the makeup and stuff. That was really fun to like see and to do.
As soon as I was cast in the movie, I went running off to Blockbuster and I rented just about every werewolf movie that there was. I basically was doing a lot of research to see how other people moved when they turned into the werewolf. And watching the Lon Chaney, the Wolfman.
I definitely think that it's tragic because he's been cursed like this. I don't think that he's a monster you look at and think, oh, he's so mean. You look at him and you pity him because you can see in his eyes that he doesn't really want to do what he's doing, but because he's cursed, he kind of has to go along with it, and he does what he does.
Please, it's me, it's Eleanor. Please don't make me shoot you, please. Please. Uncle Peter, these are silver bullets. Please don't make me kill you.
Human beings have always tried to project human qualities onto the animal world, and I think this is one of the sources of the werewolf legend. The humanized wolf becomes a kind of a dark mirror that we look at ourselves, and this is where the werewolf comes from. It's interesting, the Frankenstein movies are always favorites with teenagers and teenage audiences. A lot of people don't realize that Frankenstein was written by a teenager. Mary Shelley was barely 18 years old when she wrote the book, and she had her own kind of streak of rebellion in her. She was part of the Romantic revolution in the arts and literature at the beginning of the 19th century. And she put a lot of herself into this book. It's really about strained child-parent relationships. Dr. Frankenstein is kind of a single father who creates and abandons a child. And this interestingly reflects what was going on in Mary Shelley's life. She lost her own mother during her birth. Her birth killed her mother, and she never knew her, although she very frequently would visit the grave as she was growing up. She always wanted a conventional life, and she didn't have that. Her parents were radicals, political radicals. They also preached ideas about free love and cohabitation and things like this that did not give Mary a really strong sense of family. And you see in Frankenstein and a lot of her other writings and the way she conducted her life that all she wanted was middle-class respectability. So it's a doubly radical novel because in addition to its own amazing themes of superhuman creativity and science run amok, she's also going against the radicalism of her father, William Godwin, and her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft. It was only in the 20th century when Thomas Edison in 1910 produced the very first film version of Frankenstein that we got a really grotesque monster. Now it looks almost clown-like. It has a crazy flyaway wig and deformed hands and almost a kabuki-like makeup on. But it began to influence the way Hollywood would approach the monster. Universal Pictures had a tremendous success with the original Dracula with Bela Lugosi in 1931, and to capitalize on that success, they immediately rushed Frankenstein into production.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
Bela Lugosi was originally supposed to play the Frankenstein monster, but he objected to the part because it would have involved a very, very heavy makeup, and there was no dialogue. I think that lack of speech was the thing that made the monster unforgettable. It's one of the great pantomime performances of all time. I think it's right up there with, Chaplin's The Little Tramp, Mickey Mouse, Santa Claus. I mean, it's just one of the great, great pop culture icons of modern times.
That stunned your emotions, Frankenstein.
I've been reading about Frankenstein. I've read all the books, I've seen all the films. So for somebody to come to me and say, do you want to play Victor Frankenstein? It's like, are you crazy? Of course I'm going to play this character. There's not many characters that you get to play that can go this far. And just to go to the location in Romania with these amazing sets and become this character was a challenge and something that was so opposite to everything I've ever done before in my career. So I thought, you know, I'd be crazy not to do it.
Limbs are in good condition or salvage those. Thorax is useless. Viscera is necrotic.
The head?
Useless. We'll start with the arms. I want to try to save the major muscle groups of the shoulders. Right, let's get started.
I tried to give him a bit more compassion than the other doctors that have been played in the past. They tend to go a bit more with the anger. I tried to go a bit more with the compassion of the consequences of what I was about to do. So I think you see that in the film that when I create something and when I was given the opportunity to kill something, then you see the character sort of torn, you know, should he do that? But he's responsible for bringing him to life, so he should be responsible for all of his actions instead of just freaking out and destroying what he created.
Of all things ever born on this earth, we human beings alone know that we must die. That all we know and love must die. It's been a curse that's followed man from the beginning. But here, in this place, I banish death. You of all people must understand. What of my brother? Of your mother? What if we had the power to bring them back?
Well, in the other Frankenstein pictures, pretty much the only one that is sympathetic towards the monster is the doctor, the creator. And in this story, there's another character, Anna, who becomes friends with him and tries to take care of him and tries to teach everybody else that he's really a person and not just a creature. He's very much an outsider. He's still a person, and there's that whole scene where I'm talking to him and, you know, just saying how I would really like to know where he used to come from and just wondering why he doesn't remember certain things. But the fact that he can talk and relate to like certain words like friend, Anna, man, things like that really shows him that really shows the audience that he's more than just a creature. He's a person and has a past.
We'll start from the beginning. Tree. Tree.
He's kind of brought into the world regardless. I mean, you know, he didn't ask to be brought in here, and then once he's here, you know, he's in circumstances that he doesn't understand. So, I mean, he doesn't know how to react or respond to anything. So it's definitely tragic. It was strange at first to kind of see myself as somebody else. I mean, looking in the mirror and then seeing, you know, something completely different from what I'd expect, and just putting on the mask itself was just like, it was just strange at first to see myself like that.
The last time I watched a Frankenstein movie was, I guess, about age 7 or so. So I wasn't too familiar with all the different kinds, but I just knew that most of the time it was Frankenstein being awful and, you know, evil.
The evil of Frankenstein. The evil of a man who created a monster by crude surgery and harnessed the tempestuous forces of nature to give it life.
The Frankenstein monster has always had a special appeal for young people who very often feel alienated and estranged from society and their families. And of course, this is all there bubbling under the surface. It was something that reflected the circumstances of Mary Shelley's life and her relationship to society and to her family. And I think that's helped it be a classic, because every generation goes through these kinds of these conflicts and turmoils. And the Frankenstein story does speak to that. It speaks to a lot of other things as well, and I think that's why it's a real modern myth, because it can kind of take the shape of whatever era, whatever audience comes to it. It's very adaptable. and therefore it's very survivable, and it has survived for over 150 years now.
I think people like to be scared, like a roller coaster, anything that gives a thrill. I think they like to test themselves.
I think people are fascinated with monsters because life isn't always easy, and it's good to get out of your head and to get to fantasize and just to get out of your reality for a while. And with these monsters and these creatures and these fantasy places, it's just like bringing you back to being a child. When you're a child, you have all this imagination, and you have all of these dreams and all these books that you read, and when you grow up, sadly, it starts disappearing. So when you go to the movies, it brings you back to the child, and it brings you back to the excitement of the unknown, of the fantasy, of the enjoyment, of the terror that you can experience when you're a kid, when your mum's reading you a book and you're like so into the book and then you can't sleep at night. As you get older, it disappears because you go into the reality of the world and everything's matter of fact. So people like to be taken to other places, and I think that's why fantasy movies work really well.
I love monster movies. I like going out Friday nights and renting the ones that nobody else has heard of, kind of the low-budget ones, and you know, sometimes laughing at them.
I think people like to fantasize and imagine what it would be like to be a monster, or to see a monster, or to be around a monster. And I think just the special effects of it all and the way they look and everything is so different from a human, so it's just kind of like the mysticism behind it that really, I think, intrigues people to want to know and to see monsters.
Definitely a fan of monster movies. Just love watching anything that's different and that can give me a scare, or, you know, just something exciting about being scared.
I think we like monsters for the same reason we like going to amusement park fun houses and looking in distorted mirrors and seeing crazy, you know, completely whacked out reflections of ourselves tossed back at us. They let us look at the dark side. They let us look at the dark side within limits, in a very safe way. Of course, younger audiences have known, you know, from the drive-in period of the 1950s that monster movies make really good date movies, because you have an excuse to scream and grab each other, you know, in your car or in the movie theater. I think that's one of the other perennial appeals of monster movies.
There's so many wonderful stories that were made in the 30s, 40s, and early 50s that finding an excuse really to retell those stories, you know, somewhat from a youthful point of view was a big. It was very exciting because I love these movies. I grew up with these films, and it's kind of our 90s spin on what these movies are. And these first two, hopefully, are just two of a dozen or so that we'll be making over the next year.